We've spent the past few days debating and discussing things that are of big concern to us. So we've talked about what the election of a new Conservative government here in Alberta means for our public services, what it means for labor rights, and there's a lot of worry and anxiety in the room. But there are other issues that we're also concerned about, and which are actually related to our concerns about the work we do, the services we provide, and the rights we need to continue representing workers. And that anxiety among progressive Albertans has escalated because we're starting to see things on the political stage that we haven't seen in the past. So this, we just came out of an election campaign that was characterized not just by, a very big divide on policy issues, but it was also characterized, sadly and disturbingly, by what could only be described as a rise of intolerance. I've been active and interested in politics since the time I was a teenager. I've seen and participated in every provincial election since 1986. And I can honestly say that I've never seen anything like the last election. We had one party, and I'll name it, the United Conservative Party, that, it was revealed through the media that they had literally dozens of candidates who had personal histories of bigotry, racism, misogyny, and I never thought I would actually say the words in the context of a provincial election, but we had examples of candidates who were explicitly white supremacist. And I think that here in Canada we've been a little bit isolated and maybe a little bit smug, looking south of the border with the election of Donald Trump and the rise of intolerance there. And I think a lot of us thought that's something that couldn't happen here, but all of a sudden we saw it happening here. And so, we at the Federation of Labor, we were watching in horror as these events unfolded here as part of the election campaign, and we realized that we couldn't ignore it. And so, as part of the process of trying to understand what's going on and to prepare ourselves to deal with it so that we as a labor movement can be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, we've decided to convene a panel to discuss this very troubling issue about the rise of intolerance on Alberta's political stage. This is no longer someone else's problem, this is ours. And the conversation that we hope to start today is one aimed at figuring out our role in understanding the problem and figuring out how to be part of the solution. So to help us with that conversation, we've invited a panel of thinkers and activists who have been on the front line of this struggle against racism and intolerance. And I'm going to introduce them to you, but I'm also going to introduce you to them. First, on my far left is Malcolm Azania. He is a critically acclaimed author, teacher, writer, journalist, and poet who has spent decades fighting for social justice. Next to him is Saima Jamal, a well-known Calgary-based social activist, community organizer, humanitarian, and volunteer social worker. She speaks publicly on refugee and immigrant issues, activism, anti-racism, religious discrimination, and women's issues. And finally, to my immediate left, we've been joined by Jean Philistine Oldshoes, who is a member of the Blood Tribe, which is part of the Blackfoot Confederacy. She is one of the co-founders of an organization called, and I apologize, Apiiistamiiks. Apiiistamiiks, White Buffalo Trailblazers, a grassroots organization based in Lethbridge, which is dedicated to giving voice to those who feel that they cannot speak up for themselves and bringing an end to racist and discriminatory acts. So this is our panel that we're going to spend a good chunk of time with, talking about the issue of racism, intolerance in the Alberta context. But I want to introduce our delegation to you. So obviously, this is the Alberta Federation of Labour, but the Federation of Labour is a coalition of unions representing 175,000 workers in both the public and private sector. We have 29 unions, and these are their leaders and activists. We gather every 2 years for convention. So this is sort of our parliament, and this is the time that we come together to renew our bonds of solidarity with each other, but also to make plans for the future. And one of the things that we need to plan is how we deal with these issues that are emerging. And so what I'd like to do first is to give each of you an opportunity to introduce yourselves and your work, and then we'll go into a conversation. I have a number of questions that I hope can animate discussion, but I'd like to give you sort of an open-ended opportunity to introduce yourself and the issue and the work that you've been doing. Perhaps we'll start with Malcolm.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for having me here today. So I'm going to make this a little bit of audience participation. I'm going to ask you to take out your phones right now, please. You just take out your cell phone. All right? Or if you've got a laptop, that'll work just nicely. And I'd ask to have a URL projected on the screen, but just in case it doesn't arrive, here's where I'm going to ask you to navigate to. The URL is thegoodfightyag, there it is on screen, thegoodfightyag.com. And please actually click on that link right now, because there's a tab I want you to hit. And that tab is the first one at the top, which is Fight and Win, 10 Strategies for Today, Tomorrow, and Beyond. So hopefully you're there. You can bookmark it. This gives you an entire toolkit of things to do. So I can briefly tell you about myself. I've been politically active for a long time. I've known Gil for decades. We both were in student media at the University of Alberta. At the same time, I was involved in my first anti-fascist work in the streets of Edmonton, in which I and a group of other young people confronted Nazi skinheads at a base that they had in downtown Edmonton, a house where they drew firearms on us, and we didn't budge. And it was from that early moment that I realized that you could stand up to people, even dangerous people, and you could win if you were organized. Shortly after that, I also had an experience where I was told by some of my friends in the anti-fascist movement that there was going to be trouble at what was then called the Eaton Center. So I headed down as a young man, full of enthusiasm and perhaps less conscious of danger now that I would be now that I'm a father. And I saw a couple of Nazi skinheads who were present outside of the movie theater. I was kind of waiting for my backup to arrive, but I was flying solo that day. So there were no other anti-fascists who joined me, but I was there, leather jacket, gorgeous hair. There have been a few changes. And there was no fight. I was very grateful for that. But there was a young man there, one of these Nazi skinheads who I recognized. And then I saw him again. But I didn't see him in person. I saw him on the news. His name was Daniel Sims, and he and one of his Nazi Confederates had gone to the home of the broadcaster Keith Rutherford, who had exposed a Nazi war criminal. Mr. Rutherford was an elderly man, a journalist, working in the service of truth, and they blinded him in one eye. Sims was arrested and eventually fled to the United States, where presumably now he's in the cabinet of Donald Trump. But the fact is, and I want to emphasize this, as much as we'd like to think that we can handle this with letters, and letters matter, and petitions matter, you're going to see those right on this 10 things that you can do. When you study the history of fascism, you are going to see very clearly that you could call this like Italy of the 1920s right now here in North America, or the Weimar Republic in Germany. Some of you know that a few days ago there was a Jewish American author who was giving a talk on intolerance in the United States at a bookstore, and Trump fascists arrived and took over the event, pumping their fists, yelling, intimidating. There have been, of course, beatings, attacks, murders across the United States, but at the point that they're coming into bookstores, you kind of start to get this sense that just because you don't go to a punk music nightclub, or you don't hang out at a nightclub for the LGBTQ community, there's no safe area. If you go to the tab, you'll find 10 strategies. Stop the money. So stop their recruiting efforts. Sign the petitions. March and mobilize. Dr. Barbara Perry, one of the most important hate crimes researchers in the country, says that the most important and easy way that you can stop these people immediately before they get stronger is overwhelm them in numbers at their gatherings and encounter protests. Speaking of which, we organized an anti-fascist conference in Edmonton last year called The Good Fight, and that's where we got to meet Dr. Barbara Perry as well as many other outstanding experts. Use the law to improve the law. We need lawyers, we need people who are involved in legal research and work to take down these organizations, as the Southern Poverty Law Center did in the United States in the 1980s and 90s when they sued the Aryan nations who were responsible for murders, and they were able to seize massive amounts of their property and set their movement back by 20 years. Number 5 is very important. Tell politicians what you want. Don't ever go, if you don't go to a restaurant and say, bring me something, I'm hungry, because you won't get what you want. Tell politicians exactly what you want, and if you go to that tab, you will see that there is a pledge for them to sign. And this is very important. Municipal elections, provincial, federal, get them to take the pledge. 10 points for them to agree to, such as don't ever let yourself be photographed with Nazis, which has been a serious problem in the Alberta election and federally, and of course I'm talking about Maxime Bernier as well as Andrew Scheer. When they refuse to sign the pledge, post those results. When they sign the pledge, also post those results so we can all hold them accountable. I'll finish off with this. Just go read the rest of the tabs, and one that I have to say that will seem very dramatic to a lot of people, but is important for you to understand. We're all working people in this room. They will crack our heads and they will kill us literally. There are people in this room whose family members perished under fascists. You need to learn to defend yourself. Literally, not figuratively, literally. So you're welcome to talk with me. You can talk with the journalist David Kleimenhage, who's here, who also knows he's a black belt in karate. There's a lot of stuff to be learned. You can learn it together, because when you are together, you can't be defeated. Thank you.
Thanks, Malcolm. Saima, would you like to say a few opening words before I dive into questions?
Sure. My name is Saima Jamal, and I would like to start by greeting you as the traditional greeting of a Muslim, which is Assalamu alaikum, which basically means may peace and blessings be upon you. The reason why I thought I'll just start off with that greeting is because a lot of these things that happen towards Muslims is because they're not familiar with our culture, our tradition, and maybe just the simple idea of the greetings to familiarize you with that, maybe that's a good start to just knowing who we are, what we are, and all we are about is to give you peace and blessings. So my name is Saima. I'm a Calgary-based peace and justice activist, a human rights activist. I know Jill started by saying that he has never seen such a rise of intolerance till this provincial elections. But for a lot of Muslims, this started right during the conservative 8-year era of the federal election. So that's when a lot of us really started feeling, attacked, feeling left out from the conversations. And that's when Muslims finally realized that this is the time to wake up and really fight as much as they can to have our voices heard. And that's where myself and a lot of my fellow activists got up and started working. The unfortunate thing is Muslims come here as immigrants. They're all very hardworking professionals, or they're hardworking in their whatever jobs they do. They wake up in the morning, they go, get ready to go to work, they send their kids to school, and then, that's life. And then they do a lot of community work. Activism, fighting for their rights is just not in them. So I'm here today with one reason only, to tell you guys we can't do this alone. Most of us, we don't even know what activism is. Most of us come from countries where being politically active, throws you in jail. So that's why we need people that are not minorities to actually be there, be in front of us, so that we have the courage to go forward and fight. Thank you.
Thanks, Saima. Jean, would you like to say a couple of opening words?
Okay, get to some poa sistigoy. Nasto anok agaputaki. Nixista anasta otagaki. Nin Apiiistamiiks. Good morning. I just greeted you in my traditional language, which is Blackfoot, and I welcome all of you to Blackfoot territory, which is the Treaty 7 area, which it makes up 4 tribes of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which is Siksika, which is east of Calgary, Pagan, which is west of Fort Macleod, and my reservation is the Blood Tribe, and then we have Apiiistamiiks, which is south of the border in Montana. So I come here today to share the information that myself and 2 fellow founding members that put together the Apiiistamiiks White Buffalo Trailblazers. We're all social work students, and we are almost finished our degree. It will be done at the end of May. We'll be convocating in June. My fellow members are Melody Bastine from the Piikani tribe and Nadine Eaglechild, also from the Blood tribe. So last year, we had the option to either do a practicum or a group project. The 2 ladies work full-time, they're mothers. One of them is a single mother, and I'm also a mother, and I'm a caregiver for my 80-year-old mother. I grew up on the Blood Reserve, but I left about 15 years ago with my husband, who I had just newly married, and I had just completed my first degree through Athabasca University. I grew up with racism and discrimination throughout my whole life in southern Alberta. It's really bad. It was cultural genocide, what happened to our First Nations people, and colonization, residential school, all of these terminologies that you're hearing today, intergenerational trauma, that's what our people had to deal with. I moved to Spokane, Washington, and I lived there for about 12 years. My husband is non-native. He's from Chicago, Illinois. I met him through my sister, who had a full scholarship to the University of Chicago, and she did an accelerated master's program there. And that's how I met my husband, Jeff Maurer. So with my husband and I, we moved to Spokane, Washington to start our life together. I worked for the Kalispel Tribe of Indians at one of their multi-million-dollar native-owned casinos outside of Spokane. I didn't have to, when I left southern Alberta and I moved to Spokane, Washington, I didn't have to deal with racism and discrimination. It wasn't prominent. There were a lot of other minorities, nationalities, and I just felt like when I walked through a crowd, I didn't have people looking at me or following me in stores or, condemning me for who I was as a First Nations or Indigenous person. And I felt good. And I had my children in Spokane, Washington. My daughter's 13, my son just turned 6. And they were raised in a community where they didn't have to feel racism and discrimination. It was still there, but it wasn't prominent like what I had to grow up with in southern Alberta. But I chose to come home 3 years ago to be my mother's caregiver, and that's when I got into the program of Indigenous Bachelor of Social Work through Red Crow College. And that's how we started our group. last year we did a group project. And so there are so many social issues that our people have to deal with. We have to deal with homelessness, there's racism, there's the opiate crisis that we're dealing with on our reservation, addictions, alcohol, and these are all negative stereotypes that our people have had to deal with since colonization. And it's been very hard for me to see that and realize what my people have been going through when I came home 3 years ago. So we developed this group, we started researching. We actually are in partnership with the John Humphreys for Peace and Human Rights in Edmonton, and Renee Vaugeois has been our mentor. She has provided training for our group, how to fill out application forms for the Human Rights Commission. We are not activists. There is a difference between activism and advocacy. We choose not to be, we choose to be an advocate. We want to speak out for our fellow tribal members, for any other minority, even disabled population. So we do our work peacefully, and we want to start dialogue. We want to bring awareness to racism and discrimination. And we would like to develop relationships with Lethbridge, Cardston, Fort Macleod, where racism and discrimination has been very prominent throughout our whole life. And we are slowly making changes. We've only been doing our advocacy work for a year, and we're still moving forward. We're trying to get more people involved, more volunteers, because our people are afraid. Our First Nations people don't know how to stand up for themselves. We've been oppressed for so long that we don't have a voice anymore. So myself and all of the fellow tribal members who are becoming more educated, getting out there and building relationships with non-natives and other nationality groups, we're starting to make a difference in our community. Thank you.